Thank you again for continuing to watch these Bible teaching videos. I really do appreciate it. We're in Galatians chapter 2, and we just dealt with verse 1 last time, so we're going to get into verse 2 now, and there's quite a lot in verse 2 as well. Let me read it to you. And I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. The Apostle Paul here is telling us that he goes up to Jerusalem because God told him to. Now that's interesting, isn't it? So he says, I go up by revelation. So it's interesting that it's God who tells him to go. So Paul is not promoting himself. Paul is not trying to establish his credibility. But in this letter, he's obviously recalling it to show that he had fellowship with those Jewish brethren, and especially those apostles, those that were of reputation, as he calls in verse number 2, so that we would understand that he's not divergent. He's not preaching a different gospel. He's not preaching on his own and a completely different. He's in fellowship with. So I don't personally think that he went to Jerusalem to get the approval of Peter, James and John and those that were of reputation. I think he went to Jerusalem to get their fellowship and to establish that he was preaching the same gospel. So he goes up by revelation. And then he says, I communicated unto them the gospel which I preach. He's currently preaching these glad tidings among the nations. So he lays it out. He communicates, he establishes so that they would understand what he was preaching. Now he says, my reason for doing that was lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. So what he's saying is, it could be that my ability to work for God was damaged because these Jewish brethren did not see the need to have fellowship with me, and they maybe undermined what I was preaching, and they maybe, well, I think one of the basic things he's doing here is that he's establishing the fact that the gospel is to the Gentiles as well as to the Jews. It's to the whosoever, and I'm just looking for a little note I wrote down here, because basically if the Apostle Paul had not fought for Christian liberty, I think it's Weirby who says this in his commentary, there's a principle at stake here. If he hadn't fought for Christian liberty as he went up to Jerusalem, then this might have just become a Jewish sect. But actually the gospel was for the whosoever. It was to the Gentiles. It was to be kept free from legalism, and it was to be carried to the Gentiles with great blessing. So last time I talked to you about the characters who went up. So that was Paul, Barnabas and Titus. Today let me talk to you about the people who were there. Now he uses an expression in verse number 2, those that were of reputation. Now he went privately. You say, why did he do that? Was he ashamed? I don't think so. I think he was not wanting to engage in conflict in a public forum. So if there was a difference, I mean, when we get later into this chapter, we will see that James, who we're going to think about, and I believe is the brother of the Lord Jesus, when we think about those that came from James, they were obviously of a strong Judaistic mindset, and they thought you could get saved, but to be saved you also had to be part of Israel. You had to be circumcised, and you had to submit to the ceremonial law of Israel to be blessed. Whereas Paul is saying, no, the gospel is the free grace of God. Christ has dealt with it. This is what he's going to deal with in 16 to 21. That justification comes not through the law, but because Christ dealt with the law and died to meet its demands. We'll come to that when we get to 16 to 21. So I think he goes privately to those leaders, those men who are of reputation or seem to be of reputation, because he's not wanting to do an open confrontation. He wants to deal with the matter. Now, if that fits in with Acts 15, then where the problem had originated, they go back to the elders and they go back to the apostles and they deal with the issue, not because they're the mother church, not because they're in control of the church, but because that's where the problem originated. So slightly different slant on the issue in Acts chapter 15 as there is here. Let's think about who are those who seem to be of reputation. Well, I think probably we're told who they are in verse 9. And when James, Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, who were reputed to be pillars of the church. So we'll deal with what they say, and in fact we'll deal with the reaction from verse 3 onwards. But let me just talk to you about those three men. There were three men who are described as pillars. Peter, you'll notice in verse 9, they're James, Peter and John. Now, if you read in the Gospels, you read about Peter, James and John. There seems to be a rationale in splitting the names up there, because the James and John are not brothers in this case. Because we know from Acts chapter 12 that James has been beheaded by Herod. So this is most likely, or well, very likely, I think, because whenever we read about him going up to Jerusalem in chapter 1, he speaks to James, the Lord's brother. Now, we know from Matthew 13 and Matthew chapter 6 that the Lord Jesus had siblings. But he was born of the Virgin, they were born of Mary and Joseph. But we know there's a list of names there, including some sisters, lords and brothers and sisters. We know also they didn't believe in him. John chapter 7, would tell us that. But we actually also find in Acts chapter 1 that they are associated with the believers in the early church. So let me just turn to Acts chapter 1 to kind of establish that for you, or prove that to you. Acts chapter 1, verse 13, and it talks about those in the upper room: Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, so on. And then it says, and Judas, the brother of James. And then at the end of verse 14, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren, with his brothers. So we know that they're involved. Now, we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that the Lord Jesus, the risen Christ, appeared to James in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-7. So we know that he had a personal appearance, a personal appearance of the Lord Jesus in resurrection, as James meets the Lord Jesus. And that's probably the turning point at which he has either believed just before then, or we're not told the exact detail of that, but 1 Corinthians 15, he's seen of Peter, the 12, and then he's seen of James. Now, the 12 has got a James, so this must be a different one. So I think that this is the Lord's brother in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 7. So there are a group of men that they're meeting. In Acts 15, we discover that they're meeting the apostles and the elders. In our verse that we've read today, we discover that he's meeting these men privately for the specific reason of dealing with this issue before the matter goes out into the public forum. Now, I know that's quite a lot in those two verses. We'll may get through the following verses a little quicker. I make no promises, but I trust God will bless you as we consider his word together.